I'll be speaking about my joint work with Divya Ravi. Okay, so as a quick reminder of what MPC is, it's basically a system that allows a bunch of parties, each of whom have some input, let's say P0 to P4, each have private inputs X0 to X4, and they want to compute some function on their joint inputs. Right? The way that this works is that each of these parties compute some messages as prescribed by some protocol. They exchange these messages and they're able to compute their output, the desired output, without leaking anything beyond the output itself. But the reason why a lot of MPC protocols are interesting is because they offer this notion of active security, which means that even if some party or some subset of parties are corrupt and they send some malformed messages, they still are not able to, let's say, learn the private inputs of other parties. Right? But active security is more fine-grained than this. We really have to talk about what happens to, the honest parties in such a situation, and if there's malformed messages in the protocol and so on. So I've brought up like a standard classification of different grades of active security over here, starting with the weakest, arguably the weakest notion, that's security of the bot, all the way to guaranteed output. So intuitively, security of the bot says that an adversary who deviates from the protocol could possibly learn the output of the protocol, nothing other than the output. But at the same time, the honest parties are deprived of this output. Fairness, which is stronger than security of the bot, says that the adversary has two choices: either chooses to deceive the output or it aborts the protocol. But in either situation, the honest parties get the exact same stuff that the adversary does, as the adversary does, so it's fair in that sense. Guaranteed output delivery is the strongest notion, also known as robustness or full security, depending on the context. Essentially, it says that regardless of what the adversary does, the honest parties cannot be deprived of output. And so this provides a notion of denial of service resistance. So this is the strongest notion of security, and of course, this doesn't come for free. Usually, this means more complex protocols and means stronger trust assumptions, like lower thresholds that you can tolerate in case of protocol deviations and so forth. But in all of these situations, it always holds that the privacy of honest parties' inputs is preserved. The difference really is in this thing, like denial of service resistance and so on. And we have it on good authority that increasing the security level, like let's say asking for fairness or guaranteed output delivery, also induces stronger and stronger trust assumptions. Right? So in order to find a compromise between this like full security notion and this weak security notion of security of the bot, there is an intermediate notion called identifiable abort, which says that the honest parties can be deprived of the output, even though the adversary learns it. But the honest parties do get the identity of exactly who caused this crash, right? Of like one or more parties that were cheating. In this case, it's P0 that's corrupt, so the honest parties are able to pinpoint and say it was P0 that was the problem. So traditionally, guaranteed output is projected as a strictly superior notion to identifiable abort, because of course, sorry, let me remove this. Got it. 1 second. Yeah. So yeah, traditionally, guaranteed output delivery is projected as this gold standard of security that there's nothing better that you can achieve. If you can get your output, what else do you want, right? As opposed to identifiable abort, which has been studied more as like a compromise notion that you can hope to achieve in situations that you can't get guaranteed output, right? And I'm going to try and challenge this intuition a bit. So let's say our friend Bob over here is cognizant of the latest developments in MPC and so on. And rather than storing his secret X on, some device that could be a single point of failure, he secret shares his input X into different fragments, and he stores each secret share on a different device, maybe by some service that's provided by someone he trusts. Right. So when Bob wants to use his private information, he submits some sort of evaluation request and abstracting away all the authentication and so on. He induces these parties to run some kind of MPC protocol amongst themselves and then return the output f of x. Now, what happens if one of these nodes were to be compromised? right? We can separate out what guaranteed output delivery would give us versus identifiable abort by walking through what kind of error messages Bob might see in such an event when there's a when there's a protocol failure. So in the case of guaranteed output, if the protocol experiences an attack, what the protocol outputs is, you can tell that there's an attack going on. You may not know who caused the problem. In fact, in most protocols, you don't necessarily know which node is the source of the protocol deviation, right? So over here, like our app is reporting to Bob that the system's under active attack. We don't know who caused the problem. I don't know, but here's your function output. Like, enjoy, right? So that's guaranteed output. Contrast this with identifiable abort, which in the event that it fails, it may not deliver output, right? But what it does give you is exactly which node caused this issue, right? So in the event of an active attack, you can like isolate whatever bad node there is and then take the appropriate action. And I argue that in a lot of situations, you might prefer identifiability over guaranteed output, right? And particularly in the context of the discussion that we just had, like restaking as like a quick introduction to that. Each of these nodes that participate in the protocol are operators that sort of buy in to the service using some assets that have been restaked from somewhere else. And in case any of them are determined to have deviated from the protocol, their stake can be slashed. So this serves as an economic disincentive to deviate from the protocol. And identifiable abort seems to align well in terms of moral and actual guarantees that it provides. In particular, cheating parties can be identified and slashed, and this sort of heuristically gives you some notion of denial of service resistant MPC through like economic guarantees and so on. And the hope is that the complexity of achieving identifiable abort should be closer to this weak notion of security with the bot as opposed to like full security or guaranteed output delivery, which tends to involve like much stronger assumptions on corruption thresholds and like more complex protocols and that sort of thing. And that's sort of the background for this talk. So assuming that we are sufficiently well motivated as to look into identifiability, let's look at what are the different ways we could achieve this, right? So we can do this heuristically, like there can be out-of-band methods, forensics, and that sort of thing to figure out who caused problems in the protocol. But what we really are interested in over here is a certifiable protocol mechanism that will tell you it is this party that caused the problem. And here is the proof that is, non-reputable. Here's a proof that's, that's irrefutable evidence that this person cheated, right? And I want to point out a couple of subtleties here that may not be standard. So I'm making this relaxation that anyone who computes a proof of cheating doesn't necessarily agree with other people who have also computed such proofs or even delivered output, right? So as an honest party in the system, you could either receive output or you could get a proof of cheating of some party having cheated, and the parties that output proofs don't necessarily have to be in agreement with each other. And if you think about, let's say, the restaking context where the whole point of computing a proof of cheating is to submit this proof to an oracle and have someone slashed and so on, it really doesn't matter if we are like in agreement, right? It's enough that somebody could possibly slash my stake if I cheat to serve as a disincentive from cheating. So right, with that in mind, I'd like to say that there are broadly two ways that a protocol could be crashed. Like one is sending a malformed protocol message that just isn't processed correctly. The other is to just not say anything at all. And in many protocols, both of these ways of deviating actually have the same effect, right? So if I'm a corrupt party in a protocol, I would much rather just not say anything than like figure out sophisticated ways of like sending malformed messages and that sort of thing. So I would, as a protocol designer, I'd like to treat both of these two cheating events as of equal concern. So with that in mind, let's look at what identifiable abort protocols typically look like. Right, so we begin with some sort of baseline security of the bot protocol, and on top of this, we add some mechanism to make sure that every message that's sent is well formed. And under this, we need some mechanism to make sure that every party does send a message that it's when it's supposed to. Right, so hopefully this is a convincing template. Everyone is forced to say something in every round, and everything that they say is guaranteed to be correct. And deviating from any of these things is caught by cheating. And so this mechanism to guarantee well-formedness has received a lot of attention in the literature. There's been a lot of theory that's been established a while ago, and like ongoing research that shows how to do these things. But how you guarantee that everyone sends a message is more tricky, right? If you look at the preliminary sections of all of these papers, including, I should say, my own research, like we assume that all messages are sent over broadcast. And so if there's somebody's message missing when they're supposed to have sent one, they're considered to be offline, deviating from the protocol, slash them, whatever, right? But this is, when you actually go to deploy these things, this notion of this requirement of broadcast becomes kind of tricky to actually work with. Right? This is kind of a can of worms that we're going to open up today. So anecdotally, having spoken to, let's say, some engineers who tried to deploy these things in practice, they see this instruction saying broadcast whatever message, and they ask, do we really need to implement this broadcast? And I say, yeah. And they ask, is it just for some nonsense in the theory, or like do you just need to prove something with this, or is this something that actually leads to an attack if I don't do it correctly? And yeah, explain that you need to catch messages, so you need to identify parties who aren't sending messages when they're supposed to. And I commonly get responses with heuristic ways of dealing with this. For example, like scanning network logs or using some like particular messaging service that will tell you if somebody didn't send a message, whatever, which is fine. I mean, if you're willing to make that assumption, then that has to be an explicit assumption. For instance, a lot of protocols implicitly implement a broadcast channel by routing all messages through some coordinator party. And if the coordinator says that somebody didn't send a message, then you just take their word for it. Right? So that kind of becomes a single point of failure. And in other settings, like a lot of papers also suggest using maybe like a blockchain or something as a broadcast channel, which also works under whatever assumptions the blockchain is secure. But this can be expensive and slow, and especially if you're considering an MPC protocol, which is like a nice closed system, you really don't want to introduce external dependencies to this. Right? So going a bit deeper, the more rigorous way to actually instantiate broadcast is to look into consensus protocols. Like, how do you actually instantiate, let's say, a broadcast functionality? Right? We know from the literature that identifiable abort implies broadcast. So, we're not circumventing any feasibilities here, because you can effectively compute a PKI functionality and implement broadcast yourself. But assuming that we're okay with PKI and assuming, whatever sufficient conditions there are for implementing broadcast itself, how do we do this, right? The issue is that down complexity is quite bad for broadcast protocols. Like these classic deterministic protocols, that we have proofs that say that they take at least as many rounds as there are corrupt parties. The alternatives include, these like expected constant round randomized protocols. But if you dig into them, the expected constants, well, you have to read a few papers before you get to what the constant is. And then once you do, it's like terrible. It's on the order of like dozens of rounds. And this is kind of frustrating because in the security of the bot setting, implementing broadcast is trivial. It's as simple as just echoing messages once, right? This is this like classic gold russell end result. And what we can ask here is, in the identifiable abort setting, like, can we achieve some notion of broadcast that's just a bit better than security of the bot that suffices for identifiable abort, but maybe is not as complex as the like full-blown broadcast stuff, right? And ultimately, we want to work towards an MPC protocol that's easy to deploy over just point-to-point channels without these like dependencies on broadcast and so on. So to be a bit more precise, we want this notion of consistency where all honest parties who output a message will have this message signed by the dealer and will all be in agreement. And in the event that the sender is corrupt is where this identifiability thing kicks in, which is an honest party could obtain one of two certificates. Right? One is a certificate of cheating, capital Omega, which is, again, like an irrefutable proof that somebody is cheated. Alternatively, if the sender sends nothing, the honest parties can output a certificate of non-responsiveness. I'm going to denote that little omega. That basically says that the sender wasn't sending messages when you're supposed to. So the idea behind separating these two things is that we want to be sensitive to the fact that a network failure is not necessarily the same as an active protocol deviation in many cases. So yeah, that's a distinction that we make right here at the broadcast level. And of course, we want defamation freeness that says that honest parties can't be framed with either of these certificates if they follow the protocol. So revisiting our anatomy slide, we define this notion of broadcast that suffices for identifiable abort, and we show that it's impossible, or we prove that it's impossible with the dishonest majority. And we give a really simple two-round honest majority construction that looks a lot like the security of the bot version. So we're really sticking to our goal of minimal overhead on top of security of the bot. So let's quickly sketch this proof of why it's impossible with a dishonest majority. I claim that any protocol that ostensibly achieves this broadcast notion is going to permit an attack where dishonest parties can collude to frame an honest party in the dishonest majority setting. So hypothetically, consider a situation where amongst P0, P1, P2, P0 is corrupt and it just refuses to send messages to P1 and P2 in the protocol. This should induce the honest parties to output a certificate of non-responsiveness because this party is, not online. So whatever mechanism they use to compute this certificate of non-responsiveness can be emulated amongst the two corrupt parties in our actual protocol. Right? They can, P1 and P2 could collude to decide that P0 is offline by ignoring all of its messages and use honest mechanisms to compute this proof that P0 is offline, even though it isn't. So yeah, it's easy to rule out that dishonest majority broadcast is not possible here. So let's consider an actual construction, right? Let's assume now that we have an honest majority amongst these parties, and we have a dealer P0 who wants to broadcast his message M, and each of the parties involved have some public key that's known to everyone else. So we assume a PKI. So this is a simple two-round construction. In the first round, the dealer signs its message M and sends it to all parties. In the second round, every party echoes the signed message to all other parties, we're still in the security of the bot type of protocol design. But the new thing is that in case any party PI didn't receive a message from the dealer in the first round, then it signs a message bot, says like I received nothing, and then forwards the signed bot message to everyone else. So now this gives us the following output phase. Each party in the system does one of these two things. First, it checks to see if it can assemble a certificate of cheating, right? It first checks if it's received two conflicting signed messages. That's a very obvious and stupid way to cheat on the part of the dealer, and that yields a certificate of cheating. And now it checks if it can assemble a certificate of non-responsiveness, which is if it sees if it has threshold +1 number of signatures on, I received nothing from the dealer. Right? And that is enough to constitute a certificate of non-responsiveness in our regime. And of course, if neither of these certificates are found, it must have received a signed message from the dealer. I mean, we can argue this. And it's at this point safe to output the signed message. Anyone else who outputs a signed message will be in agreement with me, is what the analysis will show. So a quick analysis of this. In the event that the dealer is honest, it's complete, which is easy to see, and it's defamation free because, of course, an honest dealer is not going to sign two conflicting messages. And because you need T+1 signatures on I sent nothing to produce a certificate of non-responsiveness, and there are at most T corrupt parties, an honest party is never going to induce a certificate of non-responsiveness. So it's defamation free. And on the other hand, a corrupt P0 is consistent because you can group its behavior into three cases. One case is that it sends conflicting messages to honest parties. This is an obvious cheat. The other case is that it sends nothing to any honest party. This is an obvious certificate of non-responsiveness. And finally, we can say that if you're not in either of these two cases, it means that it sent some message to some honest party. And any other message it sends to any other honest party must be in agreement with whatever it sent to the first person. Right? And inductively, you can show that every honest party that outputs a message is going to be in agreement. Anyone else is going to output a certificate of some kind. This is a rather subtle primitive. There are some subtleties in composing this primitive for higher level protocols, because while giving a signed message to someone as output of this protocol can say that I did receive this message from the dealer, it doesn't necessarily certify that other people output the same message. Right? So especially if the dealer is colluding with the person who claims whatever, then we're not necessarily certifying outputs over here. So I do want to touch on an important point, which is synchrony, which is that if you notice, this notion of like signing I received nothing really needs you to assume that there's a well-defined network timeout, which is not a great assumption in a lot of cases, but this is inherent because surprisingly identifiable abort is not actually well-defined in the asynchronous setting, which wasn't obvious to me before I started this. But yeah, because in the asynchronous setting, there's a corrupt party who says nothing is equivalent to an honest party who's cut out from the network. So you can't really distinguish. You can't use non-responsiveness as a criteria for corruption. So we do still reason about what happens when the network goes bad. Right? So honest parties may be certified non-responsive. This is unavoidable because they could just be cut off from the network. And so lessons for like slashing and so on, it's a bad idea to take drastic action based on non-responsiveness alone. Like just one certificate of non-responsiveness could just be because of legitimate network failures. Maybe 1,000 certificates of non-responsiveness. Like, what's the difference between an honest party that's not participating versus a corrupt party that's actively trying to crash the protocol, right? Like, you can think about those kinds of things. And yeah, we can't guarantee output anymore when the network goes bad. And the thing that we can guarantee is that any cheat of actual cheating, like capital Omega, can only be attributable to corrupt parties. Honest parties can't be framed for these strong cheats. So if you're clever in the way that you use this primitive, you can still achieve safety or like privacy of secrets in any higher level protocol. Right. So that tells us how answers how we can instantiate this mechanism to send messages in every round. And informally, we construct a sort of compiler that says, let's start with a protocol that achieves identifiable abort, that makes use of ideal broadcast. We can then compile this to some new protocol, which doesn't make use of broadcast. It works only over point-to-point channels, making use of this new broadcast primitive that we've constructed with many subtleties that I'm like hand-waving at this point. Now, the next question is, what protocol with, what identifiable abort protocol can you actually plug into this compiler? And this is an increasingly well-studied problem in the dishonest majority setting, because traditionally identifiable abort is studied as this sort of compromise when you can't achieve guaranteed output delivery. What can you do if you have a dishonest majority? Right? Specifically, this niche of dishonest majority, but you still want some kind of robustness, is what tends to motivate research on identifiable abort. But as we've seen, it's kind of inherent that you need an honest majority if you want to run over point-to-point channels only. Right. And what this has resulted in is like this weird situation where this is a surprisingly understudied problem in the honest majority setting. We don't really have practical MPC protocols that achieve identifiable abort in the honest majority setting to plug in. So for the sake of proving theorems, we can plug in dishonest majority protocols and call it a day. But realistically, in practice, we can really make use of this honest majority for something more efficient and interesting. It takes quite a bit of work to build these kinds of protocols. So we start small. We start with an example that's not really a toy, like threshold ECDSA signing is something that finds use in a lot of applications. So we start with a starting point for threshold. We use threshold ECDSA signing with identifiable abort as a target. We set that as a target, and we construct, like a simple protocol that's we can extract this like 3 broadcast round honest majority protocol from a previous work of RBs and Minds, this DKLS thing, and add some pretty simple zero knowledge proofs to make this secure with identifiable abort, and then we plug it into our compiler, and now we can finally get a threshold ECDSA protocol in the honest majority setting that achieves identifiable abort over point-to-point channels only. And yeah, this is still sort of an emerging research direction, in that, like, I would say that measuring efficiency is not really standardized yet in the identifiable abort setting, because if you're using ideally you should be using, let's say, a security with abort protocol by default, and you like fall back to identifiable abort only when you see a lot of failures in the protocol, right? So we implemented and benchmarked this thing. Maybe I don't have a ton of time to get into the details. We have this paper online where all these things are visible, but basically we really see the benefit relative to using using a designated honest majority protocol versus some sort of dishonest majority thing that we plug into this broadcast channel. It really makes a huge difference, like over an order of magnitude. Right. So again, like, it's kind of difficult to talk about worst case performance. To talk about let's say performance when the performance is adversarially delayed. So like really the running time of the protocol is going to depend on network timeout conditions and so on. There's more discussion in the paper. Right. So in conclusion, I'd like to point out that, like, while guaranteed output delivery is this notion that is typically presented as this ideal end goal for a lot of MPC protocols, in a lot of situations, like, identifiable abort can offer a more meaningful security guarantee, right? But if you start to get into the weeds about how to actually deploy these things, it turns out to require like these tricky to instantiate primitives like broadcast. And in this work, like moving towards deploying these things in practice, we define a notion of broadcast that ends up being sufficient for a lot of applications, specifically identifiable abort. and it separately certifies parties that don't cheat and parties that don't speak and parties that actively deviate, and it's up to whatever higher level protocol logic to figure out which one to use, or like how to like act on each of these cheats. We show that it's impossible with the dishonest majority. We show a simple honest majority construction. And yeah, as like a first application of this kind of methodology, we show how to construct threshold ECDSA signing with identifiable abort, with the new thing being that it runs over point-to-point channels only without having to make use of any sort of external broadcast channel or any other heuristics. And yeah, and of course, this question that I pointed out of like, how do you actually construct honest majority identifiable abort protocols is an interesting one to study, because because identifiable abort has been studied as a sort of compromise notion, like this entire area has been left open. And that's something that we're working on now, that we're looking at how to construct general secure function evaluation protocols, like general purpose MPC, in the honest majority setting, that in a way that achieves identifiable abort. And yeah, so the ePrint will come soon. There is like a preliminary preprint that's already on my website. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Yash, great talk. So I think I missed this. You might have mentioned this already. In your compiler, you need to start with the honest majority protocol, which gives you security with abort, and then you can plug in ZK proofs and your broadcast to get identifiable abort, right?
No, we start with something that achieves identifiable abort in the broadcast hybrid, let's say. And this is about removing the broadcast hybrid, about like instantiating.
But somewhere you said that you could start with something which gives you weaker security with abort, and you can give that security notion to identifiable abort.
That's a more like just general, like informally, this is how protocols that achieve identifiable abort work kind of thing. But for the sake of the compiler, like even once you have instantiated something that works with identifiable abort in the broadcast hybrid, to my knowledge, pretty much every IA paper uses broadcast, right? So this is how do you remove that broadcast? Because
by using honest majority, like you like, because like the existing work in the dishonest majority setting, you change that to honest majority and remove broadcast to point-to-point channels, right?
Yeah. So, or rather, we show that, I mean, if you're interested in point-to-point channel, if you want to instantiate broadcasts with point-to-point channels only, then like you need an honest majority anyway. We can work with the dishonest majority protocol in the like, high level, like the base protocol.
But that's inefficient, right? That's not the...
Yeah, I guess that's the point. And we would have loved to like just take some paper out of the literature and plug it into this compiler, but like surprisingly, we couldn't find any.
Right. So you designed your own honest majority identifiable abort with broadcast protocol for ECDSA and then plugged it into your compiler, right?
Yes, that's right.
But that protocol uses something specific about ECDSA, like does not work for general functions. What did you use about ECDSA to work here?
Yeah, so it's you can think of ECDSA as basically just a couple of secure multiplications. So we show how to do secure multiplication in the setting of this, right? But because ECDSA is basically just two gates, we use a lot of techniques that don't scale well. So in principle, you could take whatever we build for ECDSA and use that for general purpose MPC. It'll just be really inefficient in the sense that you'll be doing multiple public key operations per gate, right? So the zero knowledge proofs are like Schnorr-like statements, which are fine if you're doing like a handful of them, but not great if you're doing like, 7,000 of them to prove AES or something like that. And we kind of thought, as a feasibility result, we could also extend this ECDSA thing for general secure function evaluation, but we already have that theorem because you can just plug in a dishonest majority protocol into this, right? So like what we're doing now is removing this like public key operations per gate kind of thing.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, so a round of applause for Yash, and we're good to go for lunch. So take a break.